I actually want to pause right now and step back a little bit, and I want to put it to you, and I'd like to hear from you. Uh, in your opinion or from your perspective, what is the state of democracy around the world today? From what you've read or from what we've done in class, from the reading that we've completed in class, what is your perception of the state of democracy around the world today? And I want us to kind of pause and use the chat to contribute our ideas, and I'll incorporate your ideas as we go along. We're getting off to a great start. Um, some point out that the world is less democratic. Yohel points out that civil unrest in Latin America, especially Chile from last fall, and a coup in Bolivia, having removed Evo Morales and a Christian extremist taking over. All of these processes are examples of what we might call a deterioration in democracy. And the unrest in Chile, though the unrest itself was perfectly democratic, with the exception of some of the violence, the response, the military crackdown in response, was anything but democratic. And so these are examples of some of the things happening in the world today that raise our eyebrows or maybe cause us to pause and think about the circumstances of global democracy. Let's take a look at other contributions that might come in here in the next moment or so. I encourage you to just kind of pause and think about this. You can message me privately or you can message the group. But let's see if we can get some more contributions on this question before we go forward. This will help us to set the stage for our discussion. Ishan says, democracy is receding in the world today. And compared to 20 years ago, there are fewer democracies in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and some parts of Southeast Asia, India and Myanmar mainly. Additionally, the countries that are autocratic today are becoming more overt in their actions, China and the Uyghurs. Those are all excellent examples. Those are all examples that seem to fit with that pattern that we've already kind of identified. In that recession that Ishan mentions, it seems to be quite far reaching in its effect in the shores that it reaches, not just Latin America, but Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, all the places that we saw transition to democracy largely during the third wave that we associate with that period, 1974 to 1999. Ricardo says, from what I read, the world is becoming less democratic due to protest and unrest in many countries in Asia and Latin America. Some students are saying, with the current more authoritative federal government regime, could it be said that the USA is going backwards? Good question, Arturo. Good question. I want you to hang on that. We're going to return to that question later on in this lecture, in this class. And so I want us to be thinking about these patterns and how the US might fit in, and especially based on what we'll discuss here momentarily, where we look at some cases of some of the decline that we've already talked about here with some of these contributions. Kepler says, I think that after colonialism, many other places around the world became more democratic. However, over the years, I think more countries are shifting to other government styles that have a limited amount of people in power. So there's some change over time, and definitely the historical periods might correspond to some of those changes. So for example, in Africa in the 1950s, decolonialism, the decolonization of Africa, resulted in many democratic transitions. Many countries transitioned to democracy. But you're also right, Kepler, in pointing out that in some of those African countries, they reverted back to authoritarian rule, where we saw the concentration of power in the hands of dictators and maybe sometimes parties, sometimes the military. So that's exactly right. Jose says, in some countries, democracy around the world has deteriorated, like mentioned in Chile and Bolivia. I feel that Latin America and Eastern Europe are the most affected areas of the world where democracy has receded. The world is becoming more elitist, and democracy is being used for the opposite of what it's meant for, instating regimes like Chile. So we certainly see sort of the complexity of democracy and its current circumstance. We see what looks like deterioration in a lot of places. Martin says, overall, much of this back and forth transitions to and from democracy are to genuinely be expected. We often do not take into consideration how many hundreds of years it took Europe to stop infighting over relatively trivial issues like modern standards, by modern standards. That's exactly right, Martin. The history of state building in Europe is a history of bloody, violent warfare and an endless struggle to consolidate and concentrate power in the hands of bands of what are essentially organized criminal rackets. So state building in Europe looks a lot like the struggle over the shape of democracy or dictatorship in Latin America. So I think that that's a great point, and we should never forget the history of some of the systems that more or less get used as the standard. So very, very good. Santiago says, I agree with Kepra, and I feel like you could use Nicaragua as an example. That's exactly right, Santiago. We'll look at Nicaragua as a case of deterioration here in a moment, and the concentration of power in the hands of a single individual. Karen says, democracy is slowly fading since many countries in Europe, Asia, and Africa had elections taken away, suspended, interfered with. It also seems that rulers coming to power are more self-centered rather than serving their people. Absolutely. And Karen's picking up a pattern that probably appeared in the reading to many of you as well, which is the interference in freely and in elections that should be free and fair and frequent. Suspensions of civil liberties or interfering in elections to make the results fraudulent or to cheat to keep an incumbent in power, maybe the abuse of the media. These are processes that Karen's pointing out and that do appear all over the reading and that seem to be a pattern if we look out at the world. Yohel points out, Venezuela is also wounded with its opposition to its current president, Nicolas Maduro, and has also created civil unrest. Some countries recognize Nicolas Maduro as the leader, while others recognize Juan Guaido as its leader. It's exactly right. Venezuela is a case where we see a struggle between the opposition and the regime that incorporates international actors like the United States and others who have often sided with Guaido, while other regimes and other states, sometimes hostile to the United States, often side with Maduro in the socialist government in Venezuela, and Maduro, who replaced Hugo Chavez, of course. So this conflict in the trajectory of democracy is not just shaped by domestic actors, it's also international. And so the current state of democracy is going to be related to the state of the world as well. Abby says the percentage of countries in the world that are democratic is still about half. From the reading, I understood that declines in democracy brought on by autocratization and autocratic regimes are still more democratic than past instances. Good, Abby. I'm glad to see that you're kind of complicating the narrative that we're beginning to spin here. It may be more complicated than it seems at first glance. Although we see some deterioration at the edges, the truth is that, generally speaking, by some metrics, more than half of the world's countries are still democratic. And generally speaking, much of the most important features are still intact. And so Abby's right. It's a little more complicated than just saying that, we're in decline. The truth is that the perspective that we use to examine these patterns is going to influence whether we view those patterns as favorable to democracy or not. So that's a very, very good point. And it helps us to kind of begin to transition and think about this discussion in more concrete terms. Now, what I want to put to you is that, generally speaking, although it is obviously a little more complicated around the edges, democracy around the world is in decline, generally speaking. The trend, although it hasn't resulted in a total bottoming out, the trend appears to be negative. It appears to be against democratization and against the persistence of democracy. And this all sort of began in about 2006. This was a moment when democracy began to trend downward. We started to see fewer countries register gains and improvements in freedoms, and more countries register declines in freedom as measured by Freedom House, which measures civil liberties and political rights and liberties and uses that as a measure of democracy. It's also the case that in 2018, the share of the world's population living in democracies that have more than 1 million people dipped below 50 for the first time since 1993. Now, I say more than 1 million people because, as Abby pointed out, it's actually the case that in countries, all countries, more than 50% of the world's countries are still democratic. But if you look at the largest countries with more than 1 million people, you'll see that that number has actually dipped below 50. That proportion has dipped below 50. And so we do pause and we do think about what that might mean, that the largest countries have, generally speaking, seem to be moving away from democracy. Arturo, that's right. Belarus is experiencing some of its own internal sort of struggles, if you will. And we won't talk a lot about Belarus, but we will get into some Eastern European cases here momentarily. So we're in decline. And one way for us to look at this is to take a look at the global expansion of democracy from 1974 to 2019 in countries with populations larger than 1 million. So we're taking a look at the biggest countries, and we're taking a look at the trend between 74 and 2019. And notice that between 1974 and about 1999, we saw exponential increases in the number of democracies. That is a soaring increase over the space of about 3 decades. That's the period that gave rise to this enormous literature that we're now discussing. This is the period that we call the third wave of democratization. But you'll notice that beginning in about 1999, there were a few more ups and downs, and gradually we make our way to the year 2006, where we sort of seem to reach a peak. And every year since 2006 has seen a decline in the percentage of states globally that we would call an electoral democracy as well as a liberal democracy. And you'll see in coming lectures how we distinguish between those types of democracy. But for our purposes here today, I want you to focus on the general trend, which is one away from deepening of democracy and deeper democratic transitions. So this red line here is kind of really the sort of turning point where the pattern begins to change. And what we think we know is that since 2006, the world has been moving in a new direction, and that direction is away from democracy. We can look at this a different way. We can use Freedom House data to take a look at countries with net declines in their aggregate freedom versus countries with net increases. And what you'll see is that for 14 years, countries with net declines in their aggregate freedom have outnumbered those with gains. So that means that for 14 years, more countries have been going away from democracy than towards democracy. And so that means the countries have become less democratic increasingly over the last 14 years. And I know that we haven't actually discussed just yet the Freedom House metric for measuring democracy, but I want you to remember for now that these measures depend on looking at civil rights and political liberties, like who can vote and how incorporated and enfranchised are different groups and how robust are basic democratic freedoms and rights and liberties. What we see is that countries have been moving away from a deepening of democracy. They've been moving in a more authoritarian direction. And so the last 14 years, beginning in about 2006, is when this process begins to sort of set in. And what we want to know is how long will it go on, and what have been the processes and the developments that have characterized this period. What we know is that the democratic recession has been marked by 2 types of failure. First of all, we've seen a number of what we call failed democratic transitions. We've also seen a number of democratic regime failures. These are 2 types of failure or 2 types of breakdown, if you will. And we're going to deal with both in detail. We're going to take a look at some different cases. We're going to take a look at the process in terms of some of the most important examples. And we're going to eventually come back around to having a discussion about whether or not we think that the United States is vulnerable to this kind of backsliding. So let's go back to that first type of failure that I mentioned. And that type of failure is what we call a failed democratic transition. Now, a failed democratic transition involves an attempt to democratize a polity that results in a reversal and a return to autocracy. So what this is this is a country that tries to undertake a transition to democracy, but fails to complete that process and returns to authoritarian rule. Now, this usually involves a slight political liberalization where maybe opposition groups or parties emerge and are able to fight for influence. But ultimately, what this sees happen is the sort of suppression of those democratic elements in a return to autocratic rule. So we have some examples of these failed democratic transitions that might uh, be familiar to you and that might help you to understand this in practice. So first and foremost, the Green Wave in Iran in 2009 was an example of a failed democratic transition. Iran is a theocratic, authoritarian regime. It is a very, very repressive and brutal regime where limits on pluralism and political activity are very strict. Nevertheless, there was an effort around 2019, a movement, a mass movement that sought to liberalize Iran and set about a process of democratic transition. It did not succeed. Uh, the Arab uprisings from 2010 to 2012, the Arab Spring, as we call it, saw a number of Middle Eastern countries uh, absolutely ensconced with social mobilization, political mobilization. We saw groups fighting to begin democratic transitions and overthrow authoritarian leaders who'd often been in power for decades. Unfortunately, the Arab uprisings largely were fruitless. With some exceptions, most countries that experienced the Arab Spring did not see the completion of those revolutions. And we'll talk about those in some detail here in a moment when I give you a picture of Egypt, which is one example of a failed democratic transition that stands out among the Arab Spring cases. Finally, we have electoral challenges in places like Venezuela and Zimbabwe, where there's been some organized effort to defeat dictators electorally at the polls. Unfortunately, however, or fortunately, depending upon which side you're on, but unfortunately for the perspective of democracy, there has not been the completion of a democratic transition in either Venezuela or Zimbabwe. And so these are failed democratic transitions. These are processes that did not come to fruition and that left those who began them empty-handed and often resulted in further repression and even deeper venality and corruption within these authoritarian regimes. So we have the case of the Green Wave in Iran, which was so visible and so remarkable because of the green and because of the collective consciousness around the color and how that became a symbol of opposition to the authoritarian regime in Iran. We have the case of Venezuela, where Juan Guaido, the leader of the Venezuelan opposition, was actually chosen by the National Assembly of Venezuela as in December 2018 as the assembly president and sworn in on January 5th, 2019, and briefly attempted to use a technicality to declare himself the president of Venezuela. This process failed, and the overall effort to defeat Nicolas Maduro electorally also failed, at least partly because of certain efforts to tilt the playing field in the favor of the incumbent government. That also made it more difficult for the opposition to pursue that transition. We can go to the case of Egypt, where the Arab Spring was perhaps more vivid than anywhere else. The large mobilization, the huge protests, the huge uprisings against the continuation of the authoritarian regime. Unfortunately, in Egypt, the uprising came to nothing, and it was suppressed roundly, not just by the military in a brutal and violent and repressive way, but also by groups that aligned with the military. Eventually, the military itself would take power in the form of Mohammed Sisi and other leaders who would take the reins. But Egypt is a military dictatorship. It is an authoritarian regime where the transition failed. It is an example of a failed transition. These failed transitions are consequential because they seem to indicate the fate of democracy promotion efforts at a time like this. It seems to suggest that transitions away from democracy are easier to undertake than transitions to democracy. And why that is the case is a complex question. But what we're seeing above all is that these patterns don't tend to favor the deepening of democracy in many of these places. Now, of course, the data is complex and interesting, and I had you read different perspectives for today. So I want you to be open-minded about how we're thinking about democracy and how we're measuring and how we're thinking about the number of countries that are or are not democratic. Um, and that does help us to see this in a more complex way. But the last example I'll give you is the example of Nelson Chamisa, who is the opposition leader in Zimbabwe, where they also sought to defeat a dictator electorally at the polls, and they were not able to do so. Chamisa is the leader of the Movement for Democratic Change, which is sort of the sort of mouthpiece of the opposition movement in Zimbabwe. Let's take a look at the chat. I want to share a comment made by a student who mentioned the following. To build on to Abby's point, it is often difficult to only have gains and progress without regresses to some extent. Overall, the decrease of strict democracies while having a rise in less authoritarian autocracies, almost seeming as an increasing middle of the two. Moreover, such as with Germany after World War I and after World War II, it had its dance with waning democratization. For Germany to realize the benefits of democracy, it took the stark contrast and consequences of absolute authoritarianism. What I find is that we are seeing a temporary downtrend in a long road upwards. That's an excellent point. And this is why we look at the long thrust of history. And this is why we don't limit ourselves to narrow periods of time, because I want you to be sensitive to the possibility that we are temporarily experiencing something that might not be permanent. And you saw in the trends that I showed you, they do kind of ebb and wane and ebb and flow. And so let's not get too discouraged, but let's do examine the evidence and take a look at what appears to be the direction or the fate of today's democratic regimes. Now, it is true that there are some successful transitions that we can speak of. The case of Tunisia is an excellent example of a successful democratic transition. It took them until 2014, but they were able to bring about a democracy and a procedural democracy that was a marked improvement from the authoritarian regime that they were overturning. But the Arab Spring largely increased repression in the region, and it tended to spawn civil wars as well. So places that really hoped for democracy winding up in deep conflict or with deep antagonisms between groups who maybe were in conflict or fighting for influence within a new setting that was only very mildly democratic, and still seeing institutions form and solidify in a way that could kind of corral the various actors. It's also the case that in Ukraine, mass protests successfully forced Viktor Yanukovych from power in 2014, but Russia invaded Ukraine's revived democracy and basically put the kibosh on anything that the Ukrainian forces could have achieved. That's discouraging. In the same way that Tunisia's transition sort of was met with disappointment elsewhere in the region, Ukraine's effort to oust a dictator was also stifled by, of all powers, an interventionist external power in the form of Russia, which, as we know, is not a democracy. It's also the case that various countries did wage valiant electoral efforts. They sought to defeat dictators. They often did defeat those dictators, but some of those cases cannot be called electoral democracies themselves yet. They're still working out some of the wrinkles, so to speak, that we would need to work out to call them democracies. So those countries include the Gambia, Malaysia, and Nigeria, where we're seeing a movement towards more electorally competitive processes, but we're not yet seeing a fully electoral democracy. Now, many of you may be asking, what makes it a democracy? Excellent question. We're going to be dealing with that soon when we begin to classify regimes. Right now, we're focusing on some big patterns and focusing on some of the dynamics of democratic decline and failure. Now, those failed democratic transitions are actually a small part of the overall picture. The overall picture is actually one that is largely characterized by what we call democratic failure. And this is, in some sense, more serious than a failed democratic transition because it represents the bottoming out of an existing democracy, a democracy that already exists, that is already in place, that has already maybe begun to consolidate, and that is already functional at least enough to have existed for maybe decades at a time previously. So a democratic failure, a democratic regime failure involves a period of of liberalization followed by stagnation and then the stabilization of authoritarian rule. So basically countries democratize and then they revert to dictatorship. It's really that simple. But that simple process is incredibly important because it signifies the collapse and the destruction of what was previously an actually existing democracy. And before we take a look at some cases of democratic failure, I want to look at the big picture and focus on some stats. So remember that our periods of time that we associate with the third wave of democratization and that we associate with the growth of the literature correspond roughly to 74 to 1974 to 1999. And what I can tell you is that those periods largely corresponded with large declines in the rate of democratic failure. That is to say, the rate of democratic regimes that failed per year, the rate by which democracies failed per year. That rate declined substantially to under about 11% over the course of that 30 or 40 year period between 74 and in the early 2000s. Unfortunately, however, beginning in the late 2000s, we saw the reversal of that trend. That democratic failure rate spiked and increased substantially. It went from below 10% to about 18% over the course of about 10 years. And that's a substantial increase. That's a remarkable increase because it had been declining so steadily over the course of several years, several decades. For it to grow so substantially relatively quickly in the space of about 10 years, something is going on. And that seems to suggest that the pattern is one of deterioration. Now, why did that rate change so substantially? What's going on under the hood? Who are some of these countries that are failing, so to speak? Who are some of these democracies that are bottoming out? Those democracies that are bottoming out are some of the ones that maybe you've heard of, countries like Bangladesh and Thailand and Turkey, for the first time ever, an EU member state, in Hungary. These are cases where what previously was relatively robust electoral competition between democratic forces has given way to autocracy and the concentration of power. In Thailand, it took the form of a military coup that resulted in the installation of a military leader who remains in power to this day, more than 7 years after a coup that the military said would be promptly followed with elections. We see countries like Turkey, where the executive, in the form of Erdogan, has slowly concentrated power and has changed the rules and the constitution and the presidential system itself, the political system itself, to consolidate power and to marginalize democratic forces who might hold that individual accountable. We saw something similar in Hungary, where democratic institutions were suspended or dissolved and replaced with the concentration of power in the hands of an executive. Then in 2019, many more countries left the ranks of democracies, just to name four of them, Philippines, Senegal, Guatemala, Nicaragua. Let's take a look at some of these cases and let's take a look at what's happening under the hood and try to understand sort of the anatomy of democratic failure in some of these cases. Now, many of you maybe recognize this smug face. This is Rodrigo Duterte. He's the dictator, the elected dictator in the Philippines. He's a brutal tyrant who has empowered police, both actual and informal and unofficial, to murder suspected drug users and drug purveyors, among other miscreants, labeled miscreants by the regime. This is absolutely barbaric, but it's only one among a wide range of practices practiced by Duterte in the Philippines. He also has shut down opposition media and intimidated opponents and critics. He ousted and jailed critics on the Supreme Court and into the Senate who represented a challenge to his power. He politicized the Supreme Court and kind of made it into an instrument of his desire. He threatened the heads of accountability institutions that might check up on him or do corruption stings or take a look at the behavior of his government behind closed doors. And increasingly, elections are marred with fraudulent dynamics. There's a lot of anomalies and irregularities, ballots not being counted, and results that might not be completely possible based upon turnout numbers and previous election results. In general, the Philippines has become a less democratic place. And Duterte is the reason for this decline in democracy in the Philippines for all of these reasons. Let me take a look at the chat. Isn't he supported by the USA? Arturo, I think that he actually is. And this is something that, well, frankly, from the perspective of morality and ethics, should be an outrage to us. If we care about democracy and the rule of law and civil society, why the U.S. backs Duterte or may condone Duterte is a question that we've got to address as well in this discussion about democracy and the decline of democracy. So it may say as much about the United States as it does about Duterte, that those supportive relationships exist. So yeah, you guys are all over it, and you're pointing out some of the patterns that we're already beginning to see as we take a look at some of these tyrants. Let's take a look at another one. Duterte is probably an important one. Before we continue, let me point out why this is important. Why does it matter so much that the Philippines has deteriorated and descended into an authoritarian regime? Well, the reason is because the Philippines is gigantic. It's one of the world's 15 largest countries. And with the decline of the Philippines, we actually have a situation where only 6 of the world's 15 largest countries are now democracies. That includes India, the United States, Indonesia, Brazil, Japan, and Mexico. And so that's a number that should be frightening to us, because that means that among the largest countries in the world, a smaller proportion is actually democratic than authoritarian. And this is something that should cause us to pause and think twice. Let's take a look at the chat. We've got some activity here in the chat. Yeah, I thought so. Philippines is still a U.S. territory, right? No. The Philippines is an independent republic. But that's an interesting point. The idea that I think it was previously a U.S. territory. Could be that there's some relationship of a historical kind that relates to that. Could be that just Trump likes dictators. He seems to love dictators. So maybe he's he's enthusiastic about that. And Ishan points out that 2 of those are also trending autocratic, including Brazil and India. Excellent point, Ishan. In fact, I think that India might not even be a democracy anymore. It's at least a very flawed democracy. John points out there are strategic reasons historically, from what I know, to support the Philippines. Exactly. Yeah, there are some strategic reasons. And though we don't get into it in this class, the truth is that the United States foreign policy is motivated as much by economic and national security concerns as anything else. And in fact, those 2 things trump everything else. So human rights, democracy promotion, those things tend to take a backseat to security and economic concerns. So John's right. The historical relationship and the strategic relationship seems to trump, no pun intended, the democratic considerations that from our perspective may be equally important, if not more important. So this is where we're at, everybody. This is where we're at. We're facing a situation that is unlike anything in recent memory. It's a decline, a deterioration that may be gradual, but may also alarm us a great deal for some of these patterns. Let's take a look at the case of Hungary. The case of Hungary is very interesting because here's a country that was a stable democracy since 1990. In fact, it was a poster child for Eastern European post-socialist republics. Here's a place that stabilized relatively quickly. Few people thought Hungary was at risk for a collapse or a deterioration of this kind. Now, everything changed in 2010 when the Fidesz government, led by Prime Minister Viktor Orban, came to power. This was a moment of truth, because this was a point, a critical juncture, if you will, where the election of this new government, on the basis of some resentments in society, really helped to embolden what is a very, very undemocratic set of actors in Orban and his henchmen. Now, what did they do once they came to power? Well, they used a legislative supermajority to tilt the playing field. They packed the Constitutional Court. They suppressed opposition media accessed by politicizing the state media. They co-opted private media. They tilted the playing field to basically marginalize all opposition to the incumbent government of Orban. And they gerrymandered districts to lock in control of parliament so that they won't ever lose control of that supermajority. You put all this together and it's an explosive, corrosive combination. This is a democracy, not just in decline, but in collapse. It is an authoritarian regime by essentially all metrics. And that is troubling because Hungary began, as I pointed out, as a very promising case of democratic renewal in Eastern Europe. And Hungary then causes us to stop and think about what other societies and what other countries might become less democratic and more authoritarian. Yeah, would Brazil still be considered democratic even with major social class differences and flaws? Good question. The social class differences and flaws and some of those antagonisms might influence relationships between some groups, but usually when we talk about a democracy, we're thinking about like institutional characteristics, like are people is everyone allowed to vote? And are there, equal opportunities for participation? And what about rights and civil liberties? So those are the things that we often talk about, in addition to things like executive abuses and the ways that the executive is behaving, and stuff like that. So Brazil, the reason that we might question Brazil is because Brazil has tended to see a concentration of power in the executive. Now, the executives have not been very popular as of late, but it's nevertheless been the case that some of the democratic institutions seem to be in some decline in Brazil. So we're going to move on to Benin. This is an important African country. This was the first African country to democratize after the Cold War. And this was important because it started a process that resulted in widespread democratization in Africa. They led the way. And this was a promising democracy for many decades. It began to change in 2016. This was a moment when a man named Patrice Talon was elected president. And Patrice Talon immediately turned his ire on all things pluralism in Benin. What did that look like in practice? He arrested prominent critics. He suppressed parties. He imposed new electoral rules that made it impossible for opponents to win office or even run for parliament. And this was such a discouraging turn for a country that began a process of democratization far and wide in a region, on a continent that seemed unlikely to support democracy. And so the collapse of democracy in Benin is problematic and scary and unfortunate because it suggests that other African democracies might be similarly vulnerable to collapse of this kind. Now, what you've no doubt noticed is that in all of these cases, we began with what appeared to be consolidated democracies that were largely successful in avoiding backlash, in avoiding backsliding, in avoiding popular disenchantment with democracy. Unfortunately, these cases began to see the decline of much of those democratic features and characteristics, not necessarily because of popular disenchantment, but because of abuses of executives. Presidents who were elected, often freely and fairly, democratically themselves, then came into power and turned their ire on the democracy and essentially chose to begin to destroy that democracy. And so this is what the nature of the new democratic failure is. It's a legal facade. It's a set of legal decisions or actions taken by executives to abuse power and concentrate power and marginalize other democratic institutions like legislatures and courts, to suppress media, to co-opt and capture media, and to marginalize opponents in opposing parties and actors who might threaten their hold on power. This is a legal process. It is not a military coup or a bloody, violent uprising. It is a gradual and sort of insidious legal deterioration that we're witnessing that is very different than the sort of reversals that we observed in past generations. In the 70s and the 80s, what we saw were military coups that would destroy democracies. We don't see those anymore. We see legal deterioration and the collapse of legal norms in the marginalization of actors by legal means. And this is almost exclusively carried out by executives who were freely and fairly elected. Arturo says, all these examples sort of sound like what is happening in the USA right now. I want you to hang on that, everybody. Hang on that, because we're going to address that here momentarily. And this is maybe the most important part of our entire discussion today. So please hang on that and be willing to have a critical discussion where we think about what's happening here in the US and what these cases might tell us about what's happening in the US. Let's take a look at another African case before we go to Latin America. This is the case of Senegal. Senegal is another important African country because of its history of relative success consolidating democracy decades ago and over the course of several decades. Now, what you'll see again is that the process of decline happened very recently, happened in 2019 when Macky Sall was reelected president. He was the incumbent. He was in power before. But this time, to win, he had to jail two very popular challengers. In fact, his two most popular challengers. When you jail your challengers, that's not democratic by any stretch. And you're effectively guaranteeing that you'll win election by borrowing those challengers from running. And so in the case of Senegal, yet again, we see deterioration by legal means, the use of legal means to bar or suppress or marginalize or jail challengers who might threaten your power or threaten your pursuit of power. What happened after Macky Sall jailed his two most challengers? He imposed a new electoral law that narrowed the remaining field of opposition candidates to the smallest in 3 decades. That tells us a lot right there. That means that for 3 decades, the field of challengers was relatively complete and relatively competitive. And that was an important development for Senegal over the course of 3 decades because it meant that more and more competitive processes replaced the earlier authoritarian processes that had characterized Senegal during the colonial period and the early post-colonial period. And so Senegal, like Benin, has deteriorated relatively rapidly over the course of the last few years. And what we're seeing is the collapse of democracy in Senegal. And really, frankly, it's already gone. It's not anywhere still there. Macky Sall has presided over the destruction of democracy in Senegal, and he's done so by legal means. Now, it's not just Africa, and I don't want to pick on Senegal and Benin. We also have cases in Latin America, and these cases in Latin America are also troubling for reasons that relate to the relative success many of these countries had stabilizing democracies over the 90s and the early 2000s. So the case of Bolivia is an example that comes to mind for many of us. Evo Morales, how can we forget about Evo Morales, who is the charismatic, socialist, nationalistic, populist leader who was elected in 2006, ran for a 4th term in 2019. The trouble, however, began a couple years earlier when he lost a referendum held to determine whether or not it was okay for him to run again. Despite losing that referendum, he actually ran again in 2019, and he claimed a first-round win in a disputed October 2019 race. It gets a little foggy from here because there's some debate, some controversy about whether that race was irregular or not. But for what it's worth, the OAS, the Organization of American States, condemned that race as irregular. And basically just said that Morales was involved in fraud and maybe the election was stolen. Now, what followed that was equally dramatic. Huge street protests. Bolivians took to the streets. Eventually, under military pressure, Morales resigned on November 10th, 2019. But here's where it gets almost worse, because Morales himself was replaced by a really far-right, sort of Christian, evangelical, radical, unelected individual who, sort of by legal means and as a result of the line of ascension, became the president, but has since delayed the new election that was intended to replace her with a democratically elected successor. And so, though Morales himself was quite authoritarian, unfortunately, what we have in Bolivia now isn't any better. And in some sense, it's worse because the antagonisms between social groups and the tensions between the military and protesters have continued to worsen. And so there's a lot that's happening in Bolivia that is not productive and doesn't help to improve democracy in Bolivia. Uh, I'm asked, have you been following Honduras under the rule of Juan Orlando Hernandez? Many would say that it's about to go into civil war. Yes, Samantha, I'm familiar with the case of Honduras, although I don't know it as well as I think you might. I know that it's been a similar deterioration there, and that there are some serious questions about social relations there right now. And so you're so right to point out that example. Honduras is another example of pretty much precisely what we're talking about. So we have the case of Bolivia. We also have the case of Guatemala. Guatemala is also a disturbing case of democratic failure, where the right-wing former head of prisons won the presidency in August 2019 in an election where only 42% of Guatemalans actually voted. Like, it couldn't get any worse. Fewer than half the population participated. He was the incumbent, and he's a right-wing former head of prisons who has treated opposition parties much the way you would treat a prisoner if you're an abusive bodyguard or an abusive guard in the prison. He disqualified the leading opposition candidate who represented the biggest threat to his reelection. He oppressed and suppressed parties and made it more difficult for them to get time with the media. He also took drastic measures that included barring and even threatening to jail the anti-corruption crusader who was running for president and trying to unseat him. This person previously had been in charge of a UN-backed anti-corruption crusade that was involved in investigating this Giamatti, this incumbent president in Guatemala. So Giamatti closed that UN-backed anti-corruption committee, and then he disqualified the candidate who emerged from that to challenge him in the next election. The situation in Guatemala is not good. This is a failure of the democracy in the sense that the elimination of that opposition candidate ensured Giamatti's election. It guaranteed that he would be elected. And in that regard, this was deterioration by legal means. Yet again, we're seeing deterioration by legal means in another case that we care a lot about, either because of our interest there or the regional connection that we have to a place like Guatemala, as well as Honduras and as well as Nicaragua. And this is the last case that we'll discuss from Latin America before we change the topic. Nicaragua is also a case. Nicaragua is an interesting case because there's sort of a twist, kind of a plot twist. Daniel Ortega's first incarnation was as a Sandinista rebel, and he actually was a sort of freedom fighter in that regard. But he has reinvented himself as a despotic, anti-democratic authoritarian. He's treating himself like an old-fashioned caudillo or military man who has the support of a military who might suppress or repress anyone who challenges his rule. In this role as this caudillo, Ortega has crushed opposition parties and civil society. He's looted the country and the treasury with his friends and family. This here is his wife, who he actually made his vice presidential candidate and partner in their most recent election. Surprise, surprise. Turns out a lot of these tyrants and dictators line their cabinets and their governments with family members so that they can loot the place and take everything and run. So he coasted to a third consecutive term as president in 2016 with the help of significant suppression of opposition parties and significant suppression of civil society movements that opposed him. And the situation in Nicaragua is not good from the perspective of democracy. I'm going to read a comment shared with me privately by a student in the class. Potentially for future generations, cultural reasons to not only get a democracy, but to maintain one's democracy is also important. For example, Mexico and its democratic and socialist founders had several intellectual, cultural, artistic, and religious leaders who led several movements to bring the value of democracy to the public's view. and to instill it into Mexico's very culture. Similarly, the differences between the US's attitude towards classically liberal democracy is different to that of the UK. The UK often is taking more liberties as to what applies to one's rights and what doesn't, as it doesn't have a written constitution. Thus, the cultural prominence of one's democracy should be taken into deep consideration when analyzing the downfall of democracies. And we've got another private comment from a classmate who says, damn, putting family in government sounds familiar, cough, cough, USA. So there certainly are some good jokes to be made and to be enjoyed at a time like this. But it's also serious in the sense that it causes us to stop and think about the situation here and what it might resemble that's going on elsewhere. So before I ask you a question that helps us to begin to think about these issues from our perspective, I want to pause and talk a little bit about who these people are. Who are these rivals? Who are democracy's rivals? And what do they want? Well, what we see over and over is a growing concentration of power in the executive. We're seeing presidents in parliament, in prime ministers abusing their power, rewriting institutions to favor them and to benefit them and to put power in their hands and to take it away from other institutions or actors that might challenge them. These leaders have been described as illiberal populists. They use appeals that polarize the society and marginalize their opponents. They denigrate them. They demean them. They talk down to them. They call them self-serving elites or undeserving minorities. And once they win power after crushing their opposition through these various means, they use the treasury to dispense patronage, to enrich their cronies, to expand welfare payments to those who support them. Then they neuter courts and prosecutors and legislatures. They neuter the media and oversight and regulatory agencies and electoral bodies. They use legal means to do all these things, to disembody and to deconstruct and to disassemble the various centers of power that can represent a challenge to their authority. And once they neuter those institutions, they take what's left of those institutions and they turn them against their political opponents. So they use the courts, the police, the military, the Congress. They use the treasury. They use electoral bodies. They use everything they can get their hands on to crush their opposition. And they do so relentlessly until there's nothing left of that opposition, until they have to go into hiding or until they're exiled or they have to leave the country or they're thrown from balconies or they're found dead in their bathtubs or their showers. This is the anatomy of authoritarian rule in a democracy that's collapsing from the inside out due to legal deterioration and the abuse of power by the executive. Now, what happens is, in this moment, fear and resignation begin to descend over those who might oppose the dictatorship. All the while, opportunists join the autocrat. They line their pockets. They enrich themselves and their allies. They try to avoid harm. They try to stay out of trouble and lay low. Sooner or later, we have virtually no one left persisting in the struggle to find democracy and to bring about democracy and to overthrow that dictatorship. Those who are left find themselves outgunned on treacherous ground. These liberals are just like that guy we saw in the video from Tunisia. They're educated, urban, cosmopolitan elites. They've read their Rousseau and their Locke. They know all about liberalism. They value democracy. They value cosmopolitanism and tolerance, and they want to bring about a system that embodies those same values. But the problem is they cannot match the authoritarian. The dictator is better at speaking to rural and less educated constituencies. The dictator is better at weaponizing symbols and grievances of identity politics. The dictator is better at stirring nationalist fears. They're better at simplifying a message and appealing to those who may find themselves in difficult circumstances financially or economically, but who may believe in the salvation that a dictator promises. And finally, there is the role for political parties. Don't be dissuaded from thinking that there's a role for other actors. The truth is that there's always a role for political parties who enable the abuses and the concentrations of power by the executive. The executive does not do it alone. It takes a village. They depend upon the support of a party that is willing to enable these abuses and let anything happen. Now, the reason that this is so difficult is because the situation becomes quite, well, how should we put this? It generates a lot of momentum. Once people jump on the bandwagon of the autocrat, and once they begin to help to concentrate power, it begins to get very difficult to reverse course. And eventually, it's not possible to reverse course without bringing about some radical transformation first in society or the balance of power. And so this process that I just described has been captured in a book by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt called How Democracies Die. And this is a book that has become quite popular in popular circles. It's a popular press book that talks about how we can understand the collapse of these democracies and the various democratic failures that we've discussed so far today in this lecture. And what they tell us is that it takes a village. Democracies don't die on their own. They die as a process, a man-made process driven forward by decisions consciously and deliberately made by actors who stand to benefit from the destruction of the system. And those actors include political parties who support and enable the would-be dictator and permit them to take liberties that they would not take and that they otherwise would be stopped and kept from taking. The would-be dictator relies on a permissive party or a coalition to get away with their abuses. They cannot get away with their abuses without the support of a party that enables them to do so. And so this is why we say democratic failure is man-made. It is not incidental. It is not accidental. It is a choice deliberately made by actors who may benefit more or less from the system that they believe they're bringing about. Now, this is a sobering lecture. I realize that. We're discussing a set of processes and a set of trends and patterns that may not inspire us. But what I want to put to you is that it may not inspire us. It may wake us up instead, and it may awaken us to the reality of the democratic recession that has begun to unfold and appears to be mid-thrust right now. This recession is a recession that appears to be reaching all shores: Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe, even North America potentially. But this is where I want to stop, and I want to put it to you. And I want to ask you, does anything that we just discussed remind you at all of the United States? Yes or no? Do you think that the United States is vulnerable to this form of backsliding? Why or why not? Do you think that what we're witnessing here bears the smattering of what we're witnessing elsewhere in the world? Is the United States seeing its democracy in decline? I want you to pause and to think about this. And I want us to engage this question. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the input as it comes, and I want to incorporate this input. And I want to talk about what we think we can say about the United States and how it fits or doesn't fit with those patterns that we've already discussed. So let's take some time and sit back and begin to reflect on this. And in a moment, I'm going to begin to read some of our responses, and we're going to begin to think about this together. So I'm going to begin to share some of the input from students in the class. If you message me privately, I won't say your name, but if you message me in everyone, I will say your name. So one student says the current USA has been compared to following the nationalist Nazi regime in Germany beginnings right now. This is certainly something we've heard. It's one way to begin the discussion. Joel says, yes, the Trump administration. Sorry, it's sent early. I think that what Joel is saying is that the Trump administration appears to be maybe engaging in some of the executive abuses that we associate with the sort of deterioration of democracy or the failure of democracy, kind of in a general sense. Ishan says, I think the reason that the US would be less vulnerable, though as we can see, there are some autocratic tendencies of the current administration, due to the amount of opposition in the country to some of the reforms that the president has tried to make. While the country since 2016 has declined democratically, some of the worst changes that have been considered anti-democratic globally, suppression of media, elimination of opposition, has not happened due to the strength of some of the institutions in the country. So Ishan is pointing out that on the one hand, it does appear that there are some similarities between the behavior of the current administration and some of these executives who are abusing power in other countries. But on the other hand, we may have democratic institutions that are strong enough to restrain that administration and prevent it from abusing and concentrating power. Now, this is something that I think is a very valid point. The United States is a very old democracy with relatively well-established institutions. And those institutions have so far performed relatively well from the vantage point of kind of limiting some of the abuses of power by the executive that we would associate with this kind of democratic breakdown. Gustavo says the United States has already seen this type of backsliding, especially with the Trump administration, especially with Trump saying that he will run again if he wins his second term. Yeah, Gustavo, that's totally true. That's easy. You know, saying that he'll run for a third term, come on. In addition to his saying that he won't accept the election outcome or he'll question the outcome. Yeah, these things are totally consistent with that kind of behavior. And so that's absolutely true. Vanessa says, I think the US is very vulnerable as of now if we keep having the Trump administration. However, it is not all lost because it is up to voters whether or we want him to continue. I think the people of the US are prideful in our democracy that it would not let it go down without a fight. Vanessa, I think that you're right. You know, you look at the polling and what we see is that there's more opposition to Trump than support for the continuation of some of his policies, at least if we're looking at it in terms of his electoral popularity as we prepare for the November election. And I think it's important too to talk about the strength of those voters and the capacity that voters have to maybe go to the elections on November 3rd and deliver a defeat. This would be an outcome that would be very satisfying for those among us who value democracy, because it may strike us as a defeat of a potential dictator. Just looking at it objectively from a purely sort of procedural and kind of categorical point of view. One student says, I don't think Trump has abused his power any more grossly than any other president. It is just amplified due to the state of the media. So this is one perspective. We may wonder if it is true that there have been abuses of power. One way we might look at that is we might look at, for example, executive actions and the rate by which Trump turns to executive actions as opposed to maybe legislative action. We might take a look at executive orders, which are technically different. But there are ways that we could test that and maybe try to get a sense of whether Trump is really different. Joel says checks and balances seem to control Trump administration. Yeah, so it is true that there have been things that he's tried to do that he's not been able to do, even with a party that has largely been supportive when it comes to the things that he wants to accomplish, even those things outside of maybe the order, the normal process. This is true. Joel, you're right. We have seen, for example, Trump be defeated in Congress and not get the votes that he needs to carry out changes that would have been democratically carried out anyway. And so that's a good point. Are the institutions working? Kepper says, I do think that the United States is on its way to an authoritarian rule or having limited access to power. We see this with how much Donald Trump has been able to get away with without much punishment. And I think that's a pattern with authoritarian leaders. I'm wondering if you think the decline of democracy is the beginning of the rise of a new world order. That's a great question, Kepra. We kind of ask ourselves, you know, what's the end game here? Will this transform the world order, and will this reorganize power along authoritarian lines? And I think that what's happening right now might be of some consequence if that's what we're worried about, because as I mentioned, fewer than half of the world's largest countries, the top 15, are still democratic. So it could be something of that sort, but we might still need to wait to see the process play out entirely before we will know for sure. Yohel says, we can start with something as simple as voter suppression imposed on marginalized communities to make it difficult to have change through electoral means. Totally. Like, take a look at who's suppressed when voter suppression it takes place as a result of gerrymandering, eliminating polls. Polls are overwhelmingly eliminated in places with high proportions of minorities. Voter suppression, voter ID laws, these things affect primarily minorities, as well as less people with less means. And so these forms of voter suppression and gerrymandering, we might view as part of an overall process that could threaten democracy. And those processes have been going on for a long time. And so it's certainly something to keep in mind. Juan says, yes, the fact that there are multiple rallies that oppose the current candidates, and there has been many issues that have been happening in the current media where candidates have been compared to their predecessors. One of the things that I have taken notice is that AOC has mentioned the way that Trump retaliates and makes sure that he has a news platform to spread propaganda. He has issued statements, and Fox News are his preferred method of communicating to his propaganda. Totally. Karen says, the United States is currently vulnerable to the patterns discussed because elections are coming up, but there are global and national concerns that seem to get in the way. Good, Karen. There are questions about the integrity of the election and about whether or not irregularities will mar the process. And as long as those irregularities are a possibility, we have to keep our eyes peeled. And that election could tell us a lot about what's going to happen in the future. One student said, a common trend I noticed was the making exceptions or using tactics that would aid this process of slipping away from democracy, which we can see occurring in the US under the current presidency, and seems like we are vulnerable right now. Italia says, the US is vulnerable to this form of backsliding because President Trump has tried to suppress some of the media that he sees as fake news, while vocally supporting news outlets like Fox on Twitter and other outlets. He has used his power as president to push forth his own ideas like his religion, even though he forgets that there is separation of church and state as well. I agree with the argument of the third term as well. He has his own ideas in his head and not the law. Good, Italia. I'm glad that you're seeing where his expectations deviate from what the law actually says, because that's sort of the foundation of this kind of abuse, if we agree that that's what it is. This kind of legal stretch, if you will, the kind of stretching the law, stretching the norm, and reinventing the norm. Santiago says, to add on to what Joel said, I also believe that the Trump administration is portraying actions to destroy the democracy in our country, but I don't believe it could actually occur because of how strong the opposition towards the Trump administration is. Good, Santiago. So you're outlining that we might still have a strong enough coalition to resist the re-election of an individual who may be a would-be dictator. Good. That's certainly important for democracy. Rocio says, since 2016, both Congress and the Trump administration have acted in ways that exemplify democratic backsliding. I think I can see those examples as well, Rocio. Arturo says, we are going to be experiencing history in the November elections of 2020. This is absolutely right. This is absolutely true. History is going to be made either way. And this is why it's important for all of you to know that not voting is not a neutral act. Regardless of who you want to vote for, you should know that your vote only counts if you vote. Your non-vote counts as well, because it's still going to affect the outcome. And so be a part of history and go out there and vote. Gustavo, in my opinion, the fact that Hillary Clinton in 2016 won the popular vote and lost the election just shows that American elections are not entirely democratic as they claim to be. Yeah, so in the most basic sense, we don't directly elect the president. This is true. You're exactly right. And in that sense, we've created a body that is authoritarian, or at least less democratic or illiberal in its design, the Electoral College, which creates a disconnect between voters and actually permits unelected individuals to actually make choices that might run counter to the Electoral College. So that's certainly true. Arturo points out that those are facts. Ishan says, I think that this time more than any other have tested the strength of the institutions in the country. Trump's main accomplishment in his term is not any of the populist reforms that have occurred in the country, but the justices that are under the purview of any president is allowed to appoint to the Supreme Court, or the tax cut that was passed to help the rich legally. I feel like there is a chasm between what he has said and what the institutions have allowed. Karen agrees with that. Daniela says, a lot of the older systems that were deemed democratic in the past have shifted past what could really be considered democracy. Good, Daniela. This is a set of patterns that we'll look at more historically on Monday. So I'm very glad to see you pointing this out. Arturo says the Electoral College votes has an oppressive creation since its creation. Daniela says, examples of this could be how, with Trump is taking advantage of his executive order privileges without consideration of other government branches. Good, Daniela, good. That's an example of the concentration of power, without a doubt. Elion says, yes, the Electoral College seems to draw the line among the freedom to vote. Daniela adds, also the Electoral College is outdated and designed to give smaller states an unfair advantage. Yeah, imagine giving the team who loses the game the trophy just because they have a stadium in the middle of nowhere. and Maria agrees with that. Martin says, yes, though it is likely more resistant as we see with constant gridlock and rising partisanship, no move made by current administration goes without a challenge, though I find it more likely for the fall of the US Republic to come from the populace in taking our foundings, personal and national principles for granted, to not question research and accept talking points on face value. Good, Martin. Arturo adds, I'm also worried about the US census, to be honest. If it is not extended a lot of people might not be counted correctly this year, and that affects everything, especially minority communities. And so that's exactly right, Arturo. Daniela says, also voting restrictions on minorities and not allowing people with felonies, predominantly who affect lower income people of color. It's exactly right. It's another form of suppression. Grace adds, absolutely. And I think everything from Trump's administration is showing that the US is vulnerable to this form of backsliding. In his attempts to suppress recent protests, to further create voter suppression through the decline of the post office, as well as putting families in cages. And while, yes, we are able to vote him out, I do think that the way he has been getting away with these actions show that this is already happening in a way. And Daniela agrees with that, and I'm sure that many of you do because it's very well put. Daniela adds, especially with COVID right now, there are active instances of trying to suppress voters. John adds, the other thing that so far I have not seen mentioned is how many state legislatures look like. And this is a trend that has been existed before Trump. Wisconsin legislature, for example, has a solid majority of Republicans in power despite only receiving 44% of the vote in 2018. That's exactly right, John. We're just about done here. Let me read the rest of these comments, everybody. I'm so glad that you contributed. Daniela adds, this can be seen with how the USPS is being defunded, which is how mail-in voting would be submitted, especially now with people not wanting to go to polling places. Arturo says, yeah, a lot of these state legislatures have kept power due to gerrymandering. Daniela adds, isn't a lot of past gerrymandering based off old segregation, de jure and de facto? Totally. And gerrymandering is very intentional, and they draw districts to break and concentrate different groups, particularly minority groups, who disproportionately vote for Democrats. And so, yes, these are all problems. And what we've identified as a class is the set of issues that we face here in the United States, and what challenges may be confronting the democracy as we know it here. We're going to take a look at more of these as we go along. We'll be discussing the case of the United States more, but what I want you to be prepared for is to learn from the United States and to learn from other countries so that we can reflect on the United States as well as understand those countries. And so, everyone, this is going to conclude our discussion for today and our lecture for today. I'm so happy with your involvement and your contributions. This was just a great class. I think we did a really good job. And I hope that we've got a good start for what comes next, which is a deeper study of some more patterns before we begin to actually analyze the transitions themselves. Yohel is going to add one thing. Remember when Trump said on live TV about China's president for life paragraph, he later added, maybe we'll give that a shot someday. Sounds pretty alarming. It does from the point of view of democracy. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to stick around for a few minutes to take any questions that you might have, but we are done for today, and you are welcome to be on your way. I'll see you on Wednesday, and I'll be here for a few minutes to take any questions that might come up. Hey, thank you, everybody. So glad to have you here.